So, one of the things that really surprises me is how victims and abusers often are mirroring each other, but like the light side and the dark side, essentially. So, for an example of this, would be the way that an abuser assumes that other people think the way they do, act the way they do, would make the choices that they would make. And so they often have hostile attribution bias toward other people. And it's confusing for victims of abuse because, when you're the recipient of it, you're thinking, well, why would you think that I have these, machinations behind the scenes, ill intent? I haven't done anything that would give you that impression. And the reason why they think that is because they're projecting how they would think about a situation onto you, how they think people are. And victims do the same thing often. So, what they'll do is they will project their own positive, good assumptions onto other people where it doesn't necessarily make sense. And so, one of the things I know that I really struggled to learn was that I thought, hilariously, that if you were good to people, they would appreciate it, and they would be good to you. I thought that's how things worked. I don't know if I picked that up in kindergarten or where I specifically got that kind of thinking from. But I just assumed that if you were a good person and you treated other people well, that they would treat you well in return. And I kept discovering situations where that was not the case. And I couldn't figure it out. Like, why would this keep happening? And it's one reason why I came up with, the pay attention to goodness rule, which is pay attention to how people respond to goodness. If they respond in a healthy, normal way, they think of things in probably a healthy, normal way. But abusers, unsafe, and toxic people will respond to goodness in these weird upside down ways. So, like, for example, if you do a good thing for another person, even something they've asked for, they may assume you're doing it to be manipulative or to get power over them or something like that. And it wouldn't occur to the victim because that's not how the victim thinks. That's not how the victim approaches the world. That's not like the schema they use for the universe. And so you'll see these conflicts between values and ways of thinking of the world and how people make choices. And you see abusers often say things like, well, everybody does XYZ, or everyone would do this. And I just need to do it first because I don't want someone to do it to me. Which is an approach that doesn't make sense to many victims of abuse because that's fundamentally a very negative way of viewing the world. And so reality is more in the middle. I've come to find out being overly optimistic about people is not discerning. However, being overly negative about people is unfair. And so being in that sort of in-between space where you wait to see how people act and respond instead of assuming all people are one way. I know for me personally that I have realized that not being discerning about how someone might respond to goodness ends up where you're in weird situations. Another example would be it's the who touched it last situation. So let's say you have a person who needs help and you help them with a thing, right? And then maybe the thing breaks later on and they go, oh no, you messed up my thing. And it's like, it's not even related. And why would you think that? And why would this be your automatic response? Well, the thing is, they have a blame orientation, but they don't want to be blamed. So they have to find someone that's not them to pin it on. And that person, you who was trying to be helpful, you end up with the blame in a way that doesn't make sense to you. I learned that because I was volunteering at a nonprofit and the lady's printer was having issues. And I was like, oh, okay, we'll just like, we'll reset it. We'll do this thing, bleep, beep, beep, blow out the cart, make sure there's no like dust in there, just sort of going through like a basic process. Anyway, it started working. And then 2 weeks later, it stopped working again. And instead of saying like, oh, hey, what do you think it might be? Because it's something's happened again. Her immediate go-to was like, well, you did something wrong to my printer. And I was like, oh, I've clearly misunderstood something about psychology and people. So anyway, I just want to put that out there because for many victims of abuse, you're going to have these like WTF moments where what other people are doing doesn't make sense. And it's because that your orientation of how the world is and how people are is not happening, and it's confusing. Or you're interacting with somebody who, when they're explaining to you their orientation of how the world is and how people are, doesn't make sense to you. And you're like, well, that's weird. Why would you think that? So victims of abuse may be naive and think that people are good, whereas abusers may be overly pessimistic and have hostile attribution bias and assume that everyone's out to get them. And when those two schemas collide, it's often extremely confusing for the victim. And then you end up fighting with the abuser about reality. But of course, they will never accept that you don't have negative intentions, that you aren't intending to manipulate them, that the way they're thinking that you think is a projection. Fundamentally, they don't have empathy. It was this thing I read on the subreddit where someone said the reason why like unsafe people project onto other people is because they're the only person they know, and they don't have like that they understand, and they don't have empathy to understand other people. So they're just going to project themselves and how they would think and what they would do onto other people. And so they live in a world that is a reflection of who they are. And victims, they live in a world that is a reflection of who they are. But other people may not be like that. So you run into problems. Anyway, I hope this makes sense. And I'll talk to you next time.